Brews and Banter.
Hi, Frank.
You're rolling, how are you?
I'm great, and we have a great guest with us today. We're going to let him introduce himself really quick, and then we'll talk about what kind of beer we're drinking.
Hey, Frank. Hey, Roman. Hey, Brews and Banters. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Joshua Lastine. I'm an entertainment lawyer in Los Angeles doing transactional entertainment work, basically just contracts for studios, actors, influencers, and anyone who makes creative stuff.
Awesome, Joshua. Thanks for joining us. We asked you to join us for a beer, and you got one. Tell us what you're drinking.
Yeah. You know, it's always 5 o'clock somewhere, right? I guess it's only 3 o'clock in LA. But I managed to find Pacifico in the fridge.
Nice.
I don't get paid by Pacifico, but I do like Pacifico. So.
Awesome.
Yeah, we don't get paid either, so we're all good there.
And Frank and I are drinking Haberle. It's a very old brewery that was originated here in Syracuse. And so we're going to have this.
1857, I think is when.
Yeah.
And you see, while you pour, to illustrate kind of what I do, you know, my job would be to work with you guys in terms of, you know, if that beer company reached out and we're like, hey, we want to do some promotion, some ad swaps, you know, in exchange for some cash to the podcast or for promotion, for screen time, for free beer, you know, we negotiate potential deals all the time on podcast sponsorships just like yours, just to kind of illustrate what it is that I do macroly.
We'll get into that. Well, cheers to the future deals. Cheers. So, Joshua.
Although I don't have a nice cup like you guys have.
Not yet. Maybe it's on the way.
Joshua, give us a brief, you know, introduction to what got you into this kind of industry.
Yeah, you know, I'm from small town, middle of bumfuck nowhere, Iowa. Always knew I wanted to get the heck out of there. Always knew I wanted to be part of the filmmaking process. You know, growing up as a kid, I was really weird. I was into business and economics and law and history and politics, and I always knew I wanted to do something in that vein. But I also knew I wanted to work with and support filmmakers, and by extension, you know, television, music, podcasts, which weren't a thing back then, but, you know, fall under the Zygus, the entertainment umbrella now. I just always had such a passion working directly with creatives and, you know, using my skill sets as a lawyer, using the skill sets that I've cultivated over the last 30 years in terms of drafting contracts, negotiating, writing, and knowing the ins and outs of the business side of things. I feel like I have the perfect marriage where I get to sit and work directly with creatives that are working on, you know, whether that's the next podcast or next feature film, the next puppet show, whatever it is. But I also get to kind of act as like the backbone or the muscle, if you will, in terms of making sure that the deals are drafted and negotiated correctly and that my clients get the best deals put forth in front of them.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And then do you remember what your very first contract was?
Goodness. I don't remember what my very first contract was specifically, but my very first legal job in entertainment, I was a legal intern for American Idol back in 2010, 2011. And in part of that, you know, they record the show and then they use music, right? They use Bon Jovi, Living on a Prayer, multiple times throughout the season of the show. One guy might be singing it as far as his visual vocals. If he's a contestant, they might have Bon Jovi play a special performance of his song. They may have the music in the background when they're like doing cutaway scenes or something like that. My job was to literally watch the show with a stopwatch in hand, time out how much time was used of each particular song, jot it down and record it, and make sure that the corresponding music licensing contracts between the show and the music publishers and the record labels themselves accurately reflected the usage time, that the fees were correct, and that we were using these particular songs or this particular music in these individual particular episodes. So not specifically what song or deal in particular, but I do remember, I think that season, Philip Phillips won. He was singing Have You Ever Seen the Rain? And I just had to listen to that song over and over and over again. because he won the season. So in every episode, they
Right.
play him back playing that song, and his progression throughout the season is just like, So my very first foray into entertainment business and legal affairs was at American Idol doing music licensing. Have had a wide variety of experience since then. I do animation, I do podcasts, like I mentioned, live action television, studio feature films, indie feature films, Instagram influencers, OF content creators, anyone who sits in front of the camera or behind the camera to make content, and they have a contract that goes into it. They're getting paid some cash. My eyes are on it, and making sure that it's accurate.
Sure. So did you represent American Idol or the contestants themselves as well? Or did they
I represented the show. I represented American Idol.
Okay.
So part of the corporate business and legal affairs structure, my job is to make sure that all the music was contracted and reported for, and then I turn that over to the accounting department to make sure that all the record labels and publishers got paid for the songs that are used on that show.
What do you do with the contestants who have like an original song? Is there like a copyright contract before they perform that song?
So usually, and it's been a minute since I've familiarized myself with those particular contracts, so I can just kind of tell you in general what an unscripted music like show would include. But usually, if there is songs written for a contestant in connection with that specific show, the show themselves would in fact own the songs, because largely they would be putting up the writers that would help the contestant write the song. They'd be putting up the recording studio and the sound machines and everything needed to record that particular music. So if it's something, that the contestant is working on directly in connection with that show, the show is going to own it outright. Mm-hmm. Now, to caveat that, if someone brings in something, if someone has created something that is wholly unique and original of their own, pre-existing and predating the whole American Idol thing, and if they want to use that song, or we can broaden it up to say anyone who creates some sort of IP before getting into bed with another IP content creator, another monolith, another company, they should really, really specify that they've pre-created this work, this music, this copyright, whatever it is, and that even though I'm getting into bed with this company, anything that I've created that pre-exists prior to my employment, my contract, whatever with these people, that's still my property. And that's something very common that I draft for, not just what would be a music contestant, but like for a lot of, I represent a lot of studio executives that move from Netflix to Apple to wherever. And, they're all working on various individual projects in their own capacity, because everyone's got a side hustle nowadays, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's got a side hustle, but, we make sure we carve out in those contracts that, like, hey, you're going to work for Netflix, notwithstanding that you've independently created these other things that are incubating in the background, and Netflix can't claim ownership of those things.
Yeah, so these things are, these can be, from what I understand, these can be layered. You could represent a manager for a client and the client. So you've got to remain impartial for both people, but you're working for the best deal for both. So it's kind of a weird situation to be in.
Yeah, first and foremost, I always say that my duty of loyalty always goes to the individual creative. If I'm working directly with a manager who brings me their client, I'm pretty quick to tell them that, like, I'm the relationship is with me and the client, and I'm helping you on their behalf. Which is slightly different from when a manager comes to me directly and says, hey, I want to start a management firm. Can you help me put my representation agreements and work for hire contracts in place, because I want to get employees and I want to start repping people. In that instance, obviously, I'm solely representing the manager's interest in getting his company's paperwork in line, which is different than when a manager passes through their client through me, which astutely, that is very much how we work. The holy trinity of entertainment representation is your business manager, your entertainment agent, and your entertainment lawyer. And it's the three of us working congruently that gets artists the best deals, especially when you're starting to talk at that, B celebrity, A celebrity range.
Sure. How often do you work with podcasters?
Quite frequently, actually. One of my biggest clients is the Roost Network, which is a giant podcast network formerly owned by Rooster Teeth. Was now bought by Night Studios and will be up relaunching itself in the next couple months or so. I have one of my biggest clients is on Vanderpump Rules, and she has her own podcast with iHeartRadio. I have other clients that are in the very early incubator stages of starting their own video podcasts, video content creation channels, and getting them off the ground. So we work with podcast creators in kind of various different forms, whether that's be representing actual podcast studios themselves, representing established celebrities who want to make their own podcasts, or helping out junior content creators that have a cool idea or niche following, find that larger voice on YouTube or whatever, and try to parlay that into a bigger podcast deal.
So the last part you said is that you would help them with marketing, or like, what do you mean, like taking their ideas and spreading it?
Yeah. So, I'm not, how do I say, I'm not a hands-on producer. I'm an entertainment consultant, right? And to that end, I feel like I have my finger on the pulse. I'm very well versed in what is happening across all landscapes of media. And I think I have a good idea of what is marketable, sellable, and monetizable. And I know those places that potentially be looking to monetize different aspects of content creators' library. So to that end, I'm just a consultant. I'm just a liaison. I'm just a sounding board to my clients. Some of my clients already have all of that figured out for themselves, and they don't want my advice in any regard to that effect. But then I have more junior clients that are like, hey, I want to start something. I don't know where to begin. Can you point me into some directions of here, there, what type of content I should be creating? How should I be looking for sponsorships? What type of sponsorships should I be looking for? Who's my key demographic audience? Those aren't really, how do I say, entertainment lawyer things that you buy our services for. Those are the things that kind of come tangential to being a law firm client.
I see. So if there's like a beer company hiring you to do some kind of copyright protections and things like that, and they're like, you know, podcast, and you'd be like, BrewsNBanter.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, like if I or more commonly, I wouldn't be working with a brewery company. I'd be working with a podcast, like I said, like yourselves, and then us and your business affairs team would go out to a beer company and say, hey, we got this really cool podcast. Would you like to sponsor a segment? Would you like to sell advertising dollars? Would you like to give them free beer to promote on the show? What can we do to potentially work out a deal whereby you are the official sponsor of this podcast in terms of brews?
Reverse roles. Yeah.
But that makes sense. I mean, it's we're about a year into this, a little over a year into this, so things are going well for us. But we kind of we hooked up and we started talking with your other lady there, and I think it's maybe a lot of people in the podcast industry that we're in. I mean, some of the people you're working with are probably already established people, and it's a little more simpler, I suppose, when you're already famous, or you're an athlete, or you're an actor, something that's on the indie side of things. It's hard for us to get launched, and it's we're doing well, and we've got a lot of people in this industry that we're friends with. So this information is helpful to sort of help them know where.
It's a catch-22 because the celebrities and well-established people that I work with, like, yeah, they already have the built-in audience, but they're not podcasters, right? Like they didn't go to school for content production, content creation. They're merely celebrities, and so they still have to have that entire back of the house sort of system. Producers, writers, distributors, downstage, all of that stuff, if they don't want to go out and kind of build it from the ground up. So I would say my clients are all across the board. Like I said, one of my clients is a very well-established unscripted celebrity, but she's 26, 27, 28 years old. She doesn't run her own podcast. She just hosts her own podcast. It'd be very different from a junior content creator who's trying to build their podcast from the ground up, who has experience, producing content and writing content and just being a more grassroots content creator, if you will.
And this is the young lady, I think, probably just started in maybe January or so. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah.
So if we have listeners and there are some that are podcasters that we all kind of like support each other and listen to each other's podcasts, and sometimes we appear as guests, and to to direct this message to them, like how would a podcast use services like yourself to help them grow their podcast? Like some examples. I know you've mentioned how like you, on our behalf, you represent us with the brewery, you know, like, but are there any other examples you can give?
So I've identified a young girl on TikTok who I think is really talented, and she's got a very small YouTube following that she takes the content from YouTube and puts it on TikTok. And we're exploring ideas, bouncing ideas off of one another in terms of starting a video podcast, because I think that she would do very well and that would translate very well on screen. So right now it's the process of trying to build out macroly what that would look like, finding her a writer, producer, someone who knows how to kind of move the ball a little bit more forward within my wheelhouse, my Rolodex, and the three of us collaborating and figuring out how we want to potentially build that out, that video podcast.
See, so I guess when you start a podcast, from our experience, there's so many avenues that we take in entertainment, social media, marketing, that we always question, like, well, are we doing this legally? Are we breaking any laws here? Are we going to get sued? Are we going to get like a letter, cease and desist? You know, like what?
Like, what are those parameters, right?
Yeah, like it's so complex, and attorneys have to read so much, and they learn so much, and with this industry where it's constantly evolving with technology, and we'll get more into it. Like, what's your recommendation? Like, what would you say that what should we do? Like, how do we should
hire Joshua?
Yeah.
A, go out and hire an entertainment lawyer, and or specifically if you have, subject matter or content that would otherwise you think would be risque or taboo or might need a lawyer's eyes. Like, I'm thinking things like people who do not necessarily health and not necessarily beauty, but more like health related podcast content. Health-related podcast content, financial advice. These are things that, like, generally you don't want to be making statements about in a very
broad sense, right?
Yeah, broad sense, or in a very risque way. You want to make sure that you're buttoned up and that you're not essentially giving people financial advice or medical advice or any sort of legal advice. Those are like bugaboos that I would look out for right away. Obviously, third-party content, third-party IP. You're not technically allowed to show anybody else's, logos, trademarks, or intellectual property on a video podcast. So, like, if I pull this Superman out, I should technically blur the Superman logo. There are always rules, caveats, and exceptions, and podcasts kind of fills this little gray void area where it's like, you have podcasters that, like Joe Rogan, who you got millions and millions of viewers, and they have to be extremely buttoned up in terms of what they put out because they have all the eyeballs that can bring litigation, versus smaller content creators. Maybe there's not as much exposure in terms of viewership, so they can get away with a lot more. And then with podcast creators in general versus like television and film, you guys always have the ability to control your episodes, right? Like, you can take down any episode anytime that you want. Usually that's what will happen more or less when you get legal complaints as it relates to digital content, podcasts, YouTube, Instagram, things of that nature. But when it comes to film and television, you're imprinting that on physical copies of DVDs, CDs, records, whatever it is. You're putting that out through digital links, through PVOD sales, or through SVOD downloads and distribution. A larger content creator like a Netflix or an Amazon, they don't have the ability to take down an episode the same way that you guys do. Once the genie's kind of out of the bottle for that long form content, it kind of remains in the zeitgeist forever. You guys have a little bit more control, and so there's a little bit more leeway in terms of what you can and cannot get away with.
Yeah, and it seems this is probably heavily liability driven as far as, like you say, health and finance. Risk
reward driven. We do say, there are people that are judgment proof, right? You can't squeeze blood out of a turnip. But that being said, Disney, and ultimately it really depends too whose sort of feathers you're ruffling. Some people believe that all publicity, even bad publicity, is good publicity, and so they're don't really want to go after small content creators who if they're saying something and it's adding to their bottom line in terms of viewerships or clicks on something else, they're usually fine with it. Converse that with like Disney, who will like go out and sue you for anything and everything. Right, yeah. I think they sued a family for putting a Mickey Mouse on a tombstone or something. You have to be judicious in terms of whose feathers you want to ruffle.
Is that why some of the digital creators for Disney put like dicks on some pictures? Did you know that? There's like dress. Yes, they'll like put these
like penises.
They'll do penises and like on
the cover
on a castle.
I don't know. I think that's kind of
that intentional.
That's an old wives' myth thing. Like I don't know how much of that is blatant / intentional / in hindsight things just look naughty.
I was like, man, did they just piss somebody off?
Well, and if like we publish on YouTube things like that. But there's you can allow remixing and you can't. So if they're allowing that, someone's taking their video, someone else's video, and they're doing it.
That's
so you don't know what's happening there. But we we're doing well. We're doing good. We've learned a lot. And we're kind of in a spot where it's getting busier for us. There's more things that are happening. There's more exposure we're getting. So it's good that this is good timing for us and with you. And we appreciate. Certainly, you sharing this with us, but a lot of your contracts probably I don't know. I mean, you're obviously going to change names. I get all that, but do you have now that you're established? I think you've been in your own practice here for a little over 3 years, so you probably have some contracts that you maybe are a little cookie cutter that you can sort of reuse and sort of just adjust, like the front end legwork. I mean, our podcast, with me and Roman here, we're front end, back end, middle end, we're all ends here. But for you, you're able to probably streamline a little bit now, right?
Yeah, with regards to some very, very, very basic templates, work for hire agreements, name, voice, and likeness, appearance releases, some general templates here and there, things like that actually go into the physical side of production, content creation, equipment rental agreements, clearances, things of that nature. Those contracts tend to be a little bit more one size fits all. Now, the rub of it ends up being where it's like, the amount of risk that a small content creator is willing to take on may be a lot larger than the amount of risk that like Apple or Netflix might take on. So the contract for an Apple or Netflix may be 5 pages, whereas a contract for a small indie creator, like if I gave them that same 5-page agreement, they wouldn't get any guests on their show. So you have to be a little, again, judicial. I've done a lot of podcast deals for like the A-list, comedians, your Ali Wongs of the world and stuff like that. And when they're on a smaller podcast, that doesn't have a national reach, we have to negotiate pretty heavily an appearance release on how her likeness would be used in connection with that podcast. And so that document gets heavily negotiated.
That's why all those famous people declining us.
Yeah. It's so right. And I know we're kind of talking, this is our industry podcast, but I know for you're involved in the entertainment industry, but this is, Hollywood, you're doing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of logistical moving and import export stuff. So there's a lot of stuff, for our listeners, they're going to see this. It's not just podcasting. And we have really large listeners that follow us that are way bigger than us. But they maybe are not aware of what kind of services you might offer. So just to throw that out there, there's a lot of, you're in this kind of umbrella industry, but you've got a lot of different hats that you necessarily wear and take care of.
Yeah, like I said, I do have a lot of podcast clients. I represent a large podcast network, but I would say my bread and butter, what I really specialize in is, indie film development and production / mid-sized studio budget films, mini major films, development and production. films in the $1 to $5 to $10 to $20 million range, putting together, doing the actor deals, doing the set pieces, locations, wardrobes, VFX, explosions, all the way through final credit roll, working directly with the filmmakers to make sure that their creative vision is realized and that we have all the contracts put together to make sure that the final product is deliverable to the movie theaters or the streamers or wherever it's going to go.
So do you dictate how big the explosions can be? You're like, that's too many decibels. We're in this neighborhood.
No, but I do make sure that if we're sourcing somebody with explosions or something like that, we don't go with the guy that's like, oh, we're gonna do a backdoor handshake deal for these explosions and put nothing in writing and have nothing on paperwork, because that's how we used to make films in the 80s. We have to be a little bit more buttoned up, and liability is a lot more, how do I say, obvious nowadays. When you're working with a Netflix or an Amazon or an Apple, the appetite for risk is much smaller than it used to be making TV shows in the 80s and 90s.
But we're a very litigious, world for that matter, but specifically country. Yeah. And you could get a coffee that spills on you, you burn yourself, and now you get all this money because.
Well, here's a good example with Alec Baldwin movie.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, that McDonald's coffee cup case, I'm teaching it tomorrow night in my entertainment business law class. It's a tort case, and it's a good one because, that woman sustained third-degree burns across her entire body. And what the facts of the case lend to show is that McDonald's was warned heavily that their coffee was overly heated relative to their competitors by over 100 degrees.
Wow.
So they knowingly were serving coffee that was 100 plus degrees warmer than the coffee at Starbucks or Subway or Come and Go. So that case is often touted as being like, oh, we're a nanny state, we're protecting people from lawsuits. But it's really more of a case of like corporate, you shouldn't have done that. You were well advised and well aware that your coffee could sustain these levels of immediate third-degree burn injury that other coffees couldn't cause, because just by virtue of not being hot enough. And McDonald's excuse: customers like their coffee hot.
Well, see, and we both small business owners, but I come from a background where I'm familiar with hazardous materials and I do import export stuff, but it's different when you can boil an egg in your coffee, or if you are shown to know and then intently ignore, that is mega bucks. When you're told you're not supposed to, someone's warned you about this and someone said this is gonna be bad, and then you just don't do it. Now when it happens, you're screwed.
That's got to be negligence, right?
It's extreme negligence. It's gross negligence.
It's 100 degrees. Coffee is what? 120, 115 degrees?
Yeah, and I think they were serving it at around 300.
Oh my God. How did the cup didn't catch on fire?
To expand upon that, from the coffee cup case, we go and we talk about Jack in the Box in the 90s, because very similarly, if you remember the E. coli scare with Jack in the Box in the early 90s,
right.
Jack in the Box out of Seattle, out of Washington, there was a public health mandate that all fast food companies had to cook their burgers to an internal temperature of X amount of degrees. And Jack in the Box had been put on notice several times by the Washington health authorities, Food and Drug Administration or whatever, that they were not following code. And there was several memos, internal memos back and forth, essentially saying we're going to ignore this rule because the internal temperature that they want us to reach is going to make our burgers taste like tar or something like that. So again, going back to you were blatantly warned and chose to ignore it. A bunch of kids died because of E. coli. They had well enough a warning ahead of time, which is why the lawsuits were so egregious or so big the way that they were.
Sure. Yep. I sometimes think that the penalty for ignoring those warnings and the profitable gain, financial gain, before you get fined is greater. So they sometimes, I think, choose to ignore that And then they're like, okay, when we get sued, we'll deal with it, but the profits we're going to make is greater. And
that's absolutely how it's been thought of in the past. And like the Ford Pinto is kind of the famous example of that, where it's like, hey, we can recall these cars and it's going to cost us X number of dollars to recall, but we calculated and it's going to cost us this amount of money to settle with survivors, and that number's lower, so we're going to go with that. I would hope that in 2024, buyer consumer transparency is such that businesses would see that as a short-term gain versus the long-term exposure to like my generation. We're very much like we make our purchasing decisions based on the perceived moral, ethical value of those companies. So exchanging short-term, monetary gains for long-term unethical, the long play, like hopefully that's something of a thing in the past. Although, we just had 2 Boeing whistleblowers die. No explanation.
We just talked about that like 2 nights ago, but this is what happened. You see a lot of these people now, and we've talked about we support USA made stuff and veterans and a lot of these, important causes to many people. But you'll see people that'll pay a little more for USA made stuff, or people that maybe want to support the smaller non-chain industry because those are the people that are making this mega dollars, and you're never going to get away from it. There's always going to be chains. You're always going to have these big Apples and Microsoft and all these guys, but it's difficult for the small person to survive in that. And this isn't new to people, but this is kind of what we're trying to help with and on the craft beer side of things. But it's not just beer. We talk about all kinds of small businesses and your small business, right?
In my business, I'm can't get smaller than my solo practice. I think I was the youngest and only solo practitioner on the Variety's top 100 deal makers in 2022. So I'm competing with law firms that represent like Ali Wong and Brad Pitt and Nicole Kidman and stuff like that. And competing, not competing with, I guess, but working against the Netflix, Apples, and Amazons in the world. I'm a solo practitioner. I have to rely on, my word of mouth reputation and my relationships within the industry with other professionals in order to get things done, because I don't have the muscle and steam power that an Amazon or Netflix or Apple attorney have.
And that's not really a bad thing. I mean, we talk about it all the time. I mean, if you can go to bed at night knowing that you did some good, greed is ugly, right? And everybody wants to succeed, or if you don't want to succeed, you shouldn't obviously be in business. I mean, if you don't want to succeed, you probably shouldn't be alive, I guess. But there's enough to go around, and you don't have to be. You can be a good person and a humanitarian and still get it done and make everybody happy in that process.
Do you have a team
and I think
now?
that's something my generation of Hollywood executives, the 35 to 30 to 40 crowd, we very much, I feel like are kind of, we see the writing on the wall. We're in the same boat. We're all here to help each other. None of us are really competing for business so much as we are struggling and fighting for the business to survive and hang on. Like, we all have a vested interest in getting butts in the movie theater seats. We all have a vested interest in figuring out, where does content creation go from here? What is comedy in 2024? I watched the roast of Tom Brady last night. Comedy's still around. We just got to figure out what it looks like in 2024.
Yeah, actually, I listen to Joe Rogan a lot, and it sounds like he's got a pretty cool club set up called Mothership, and his consultant or advisor was Louis C.K., and he on his podcast said, whatever Louis C.K. told me to do, I did, and everybody loves my comedy club. And I think what he's doing in Austin is, he's keeping that comedy alive, like you said, still around. And I wanted to kind of like touch and go back a little bit, touch on things that we say or post on social media or YouTube as podcasters and as content creators. And one of the examples is I sometimes will mention things that I read in the news. Do we have to mention source or if it's posted and it's free online, you can mention it?
So here's the thing. Copyright infringement is copyright infringement regardless of whether or not you give the source credit. Copyright infringement is literally taking a copy of someone else's protected work and doing anything with it, recreating it, creating a copy in any way, shape, or form. So those people who repost other people's content on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube or whatever, and they're giving credit to the underlying authors, that's really nice of them to do, but that doesn't in any way protect them from any sort of copyright infringement. Now, there's a behavioral psychology component to that, where the person who you are quote unquote infringing, like, they're going to, see that and be like, oh, thank you. You gave me this credit. I now am not being, left out of the conversation in any way. Maybe I'm not making money off of this thing, but like, I'll take the credit. There you go. And I mean, a lot of it has to do with there's the law, but then there is industry custom standards and practices. And like the photography modeling community has their own kind of like code of conduct in which they operate. Now, does that prevent someone from initiating a lawsuit? No way. But it is like, okay, these are the unspoken rules of the road when it comes to podcasts versus YouTube versus modeling versus Instagram, and things like that. Giving someone credit is kind of the expected social contract theory thing to do.
But it's ethics within certain industry, right?
Yeah, it's more ethical, and from that perspective, you get a +1, a brownie point. But from a legal perspective, just because you give somebody credit doesn't mean you haven't committed copyright infringement and that they can't sue you. They still very much could.
So it's like if sometimes we're talking like, hey, I read this article and it's about this truck that flipped and spilled beer on the highway, which I mentioned in our last podcast. And then and then in the back of my head, I'm like, oh, like, is this okay that I'm reading this? Is it okay?
So factual stories, news, and information can't be copyrightedly protected. So like JFK gets shot in the head November 23rd, 1962 or whatever. Like no one can own that fact. Mm-hmm. So news and information can't be owned. It's the telling of that news and information, my perception, my recreation of JFK getting shot in the head. That is what qualifies for copyright protection.
When we started this podcast, just a little over a year ago, I played and dabbled a little bit with AI tools. And can we get into AI, or is it too early?
Yeah, no, okay. I'd love to talk.
What's it mean too early?
Well, I don't know.
Like in a day or something?
Yeah, exactly. We haven't finished the beer. I played with those tools a little bit, and within the year, it's amazing how fast AI technology has grown and has affected content creators, and not only content creators, but it seems like musicians, actors,
podcasters. They can redo a voice.
So there, and I try to stay up to date on AI development. And I sorry, last of my chain of that. I support use of AI as a tool.
Correct.
Right. But not as something to replace an art, talent, things like that. Does that make sense?
It does. And how do I want to answer this? So, interestingly, a couple of thoughts here. Interestingly enough, as much as AI has progressed over the last 12 to 24 months, I actually feel in some ways that it's going backwards, in that we've now put up all these safety rails and guardrails to try to protect ourselves from AI, and the AI is like maybe 20% as effective and useful as it was when it first came out. So there's one thing to consider there. The other thing, like you were saying, using AI as a tool, I have AI contract drafting software that is made specifically, especially for attorneys. And I use that maybe 20, 30% in my day to day. But like, I akin that to a Formula One race car where the average Joe on the street can't get behind the wheel of a Formula One race car and like do, 24 hours of Le Mans, right? Like you got to be specifically trained to get a race car, Formula One going and do some cool stuff. A layperson or a junior lawyer could probably not take this AI software and be very effectual or use it in a way that makes their job faster. Versus myself, who's kind of a seasoned pro, I can get behind the race car and make it do some really cool stuff. So like using it as a tool, 100%. The problem with that becomes then, how do we train the next generation? Because where I was trained, especially as a young attorney, I was given boxes and boxes of documents and told to go sit in a quiet room for 3 days and fucking figure it out.
Yeah.
Right.
Nowadays, we don't do that. I have an AI that can do that, and what would have taken me 3 or 4 days when I was a junior attorney will now take AI 30 seconds to synthesize all the information and give me, the boss, the answer that I need right away. So how do we train the next generation? Writing is a skill set that it takes time, effort, and skill, and just volumes and volumes and volumes of writing. Nowadays with ChatGPT, like that, I don't know how you become trained as a writer.
Yeah, I think it's probably going to be a lost skill over time. Unfortunately, it's just like cursive. Like who learned how to write cursive, right? I was
I'll give you one better. Organ playing. Do you guys know that there's only so many people in the world left that know how to play a classical 18th century organ, pipe organ?
Sure. Yeah, I know that, but it makes sense. All these things are going to be dying arts, really, and probably even like in the service industry, waitresses, like everything's going to just be ordered on a little tablet.
I've been at some local restaurant and there's a robot comes up to you with your tray of your meal.
Yeah, there's a robot does that.
Yeah. And it's just replaces
Probably started in California.
yeah, Silicon Valley. So
although I will say that you can replace all of the workers at the pharmacy. If you get robots behind the pharmacy aisle, like, okay, chef's kiss, because nothing drives me more mad than waiting in line at the pharmacy. Or post.
Yep.
Get that line moving faster.
Get that line moving.
So I agree with what you said, how you need the tool, the AI tool, to be efficient, but you still need a professional to polish the finished work. And, our sign is an example of, I use an AI to get a basic design of it.
Yes, sir.
And then I had to go use other software tools like photo editing and some of my creativity, and tweak it to make it so that it is what I'm looking for. Because no matter how you code it or you write it, AI is not going to understand your thoughts or what you're thinking or what your vision is.
Yeah.
However, with the fast progression of AI, and I don't know how much you have followed or know, but AI can now, with just maybe 6 to 10 sentences of a person reading something, can now use my voice and use it for an advertisement purposes. So how is that protected? Or there's AI softwares that can take an Eminem rap style and create your own rap with Eminem's style. So like, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I'll back up and I'll tell a longer story I'll go a long way to make a short point. But, when I was in high school, our cell phones were still pixelated, right? They're like giant bricks. And like, you couldn't take a picture. You could play Snake and you could like maybe make an image. You could spell boobs with like the pixelated calculator or whatever. But you couldn't send high definition images and videos to one another in real time. Fast forward past college and going into law school. Now in law school, we have the technology to instantly send videos and text messages and images to one another. And within the first year of law school, we start hearing about these new laws that have never existed before, aka laws to protect against revenge porn, right? The sharing of explicit photos in real time in high definition. It wasn't really a problem that we as humans had faced in a meaningful way until the technology got to the point where it became an issue. Where I'm going with that is that we need legislation to catch up to where technology is. In particular, what you're talking about with like creating, deep fakes and things like that. There is no federal national right of likeness. There is no federal national right of privacy. Every individual state handles its own right of likeness laws individually, California being the most protective. But generally speaking, that kind of comes into two regulated forms, regulated from the aspect of commercial speech. So like if you're making a buck off of somebody else's name, voice, or likeness, you're gonna get in trouble. Using somebody's voice to run advertisements or promotions, or like what you said, the story of the beer truck flipping over, you're not making money about the beer truck flipping over. But if you put a picture of Sydney Sweeney drinking a Bud Light and being like, this, podcast is sponsored by Sydney Sweeney and Bud Light, and all of a sudden you have 1 million viewers and you're making money off of that, that is where the law will step in and slap your wrists. Similarly, the law will step in and slap your wrists to the extent that you're saying, defamatory things, again, hurting the pockets of whomever you're speaking about. But that state level right of privacy, state level defamation claims, that is wholly inaccurate in addressing the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room that is AI, and what happens when, creepy neighbor deep fakes a porno of his neighbor for his own personal enjoyment and consumption. He's not making any money off of that, and it's not being, how do I say, for defamation, it has to be published to the audience at large. So where is the recourse for that? We don't have it yet. It has to come in the form of new legislation.
So legislation within the local government has to be passed, and that has to be brought to attention first, right? Because the government's not going to go out of the way and start worrying about people who are being affected by, AI, scams.
I would highly disagree. The Taylor Swift of it all brought the conversation very quickly to national attention.
Because she's Taylor Swift. Right?
It wasn't maybe even 24 hours later that Joe Biden, and other, federal level politicians were starting to call for, some sort of committee or something to investigate and address how they're going to be handling it. There are many states that are enacting their own miniature AI laws. I know Nashville has a Elvis Presley Act that I don't know the ins and outs of it particularly, but it helps shield individual rights against AI law or AI technologies. So at the state law level, things are happening in those states that find it pertinent to address. Nashville, they got a lot of singers, so they're going to address it there. New York, California, Florida, they'll probably have laws on the books to address it there. But Iowa, going to be a while until the state legislator in Iowa really cares enough to make a law about deepfakes or AI. But really, we need some sort of right of national likeness at the federal level. We need some sort of constitutional protection over our own image. I mean, if you're even thinking about it in terms of photography, if I'm the subject matter of a photo, I don't own the copyright of that photo. The photographer does. And so, this goes back to Marilyn Monroe and her first nude images being sold to Hugh Hefner and Playboy against her will. The photographer owns the copyrights to those photos. Absent some level of state law claim, they have zero protection. So we need to have some sort of national right of likeness, national ownership of yourself in some way.
I thought there were laws put in place to protect people, like from photography and taking content that you would make money off of. So like if I hired a model to shoot some product or something, I had to have her sign a form giving me consent that I can use her photos for marketing.
Every fact and circumstances is very different. If the model is not famous and she didn't sign any agreement with the photographer, technically the photographer owns that copyright and he can monetize the photo any way he sees fit. Now, if it's a picture of Sydney Sweeney, she obviously has a lot more clout and a lot more manpower behind her to say, oh, you're only using this image because it's Sydney Sweeney, and therefore you're profiting off of Sydney Sweeney's likeness versus the artistic value of the photo itself. Right? Because think about it. If I take a picture of a baby and I sell it for $1 million, is it because the baby's famous or is it the artistic value of the baby? That's a sliding scale, you know. You get a very famous photographer and a very famous subject matter. What makes the property famous is left to a question.
Mm-hmm. And so recently there have been protests in Hollywood. Have they been related due to the AI and how it affects them? And what do you think of that?
So you know, we had two very large strikes over almost the entirety of 2023. Both the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild of America for actors and writers went on strike in part because of these AI issues. Now, the deals that they essentially brokered with the Producers Guild and the studios who would be signing on to be signatories to SAG and the WGA, they slightly addressed the AI issue, but it's challenging because we live in a very, you know, capitalistic society where it's like, hey, you know, people are going to be allowed to freely bargain and freely contract around anything. So the protection kind of stops to the extent you freely consent to sell your rights. Let's forget about the bargaining power in discrepancy between a Netflix and a junior actor. Like, we're going to ignore that. If the junior actor says, hey, Netflix, I'm selling you all my AI rights for $1, there's not a lot that the guilds are going to do to step into to nanny and say, oh, you can't sell your rights, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get it. I was listening to what's his name? He's a host on America's Got Talent. Bald guy, he's a comedian. Howie Mandel.
Yeah.
Howie Mandel was on Joe Rogan's show, and he was talking about how he sold his rights to his voice to a company. He uses it now through the AI tools for advertising purposes and things like that. So is that kind of what you were talking about?
Yeah, you know, the smart celebrities will get out ahead of it and they'll say, hey, this is an easy way for me to monetize myself without having to actually be present, right? Like, again, going back to Sydney Sweeney, she can, you know, sell her voice to sell Coca-Cola commercials. If she doesn't have to show up to a sound booth, that means she's getting paid and she can go work something else and get paid at the exact same time, right? So yeah, high-profile celebrities have a large incentive nowadays to figure out a way to protect their likeness by relicensing it to the highest bidder, and then relying on that person's, you know, license or ownership to kind of police and protect the world. Because like if Netflix has a license to use Arnold Schwarzenegger and Apple makes an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, Netflix is going to sue Apple. So there's a little bit of checks and balances that way. Celebrities are getting ahead of the issue in that they're saying, okay, we know you're going to do this anyway, pay us for it, and we'll grant you the rights free and clear while the laws are still being established and not clearly defined.
It's really pretty brilliant because, like you say, if that's the case, you've got these big corporations that are going to help you defend and fight against that. It's not all out of pocket for yourself. So, and there's some power in that sort of large scale defense.
CAA in the basement, they have Creative Artists Agency is the largest agency in Hollywood. They have in the basement a giant 360 like a body scan image technology that they put all their stars through, and they're recording all of their likeness and image and voice to live in this CAA warehouse somewhere that they can license off and monetize forever. It's brilliant / freaky / dystopian /
futuristic. Yeah, right.
very futuristic. It's weird.
So I know we're getting close here.
Yeah. I wanted to just quickly touch on a show episode. Have you seen Black Mirror before?
I love Black Mirror.
Yeah. So there's actually an episode that highlights that, and it raises a lot of questions. And I just want to ask you last questions. Has it made your job more difficult because of the advancements of technology?
Technology makes my job ever evolving. When I started in this business, we were making television shows that ran for 24 episodes a season. They had a first run on an ABC broadcast network, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox. Maybe they had a secondary run on cable. Maybe we relicensed it to TNT after the fact or whatever. But essentially, these were smaller budgeted shows. They're multicam. They didn't have movie stars attached to them. They were just what we know as regular TV shows. Come in the advent of streaming, and now we're pulling in movie stars to be on TV shows. We're having, budgets range from $1 million to $5 million to $10 to $20 million an episode, which used to be the entire price of an entire 5 seasons of a TV show. It changes the economics in the deal making wildly. And AI is only compounded upon that, where it's like, hey, it threw the whole industry in a flux last year because of the strikes. We now have arguably no guidance in terms of where we're moving forward on the AI front. We have that Sonia technology coming out in a couple months. And no one really knows what's coming next. So I don't know. It's an interesting time all around.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate you taking time from your schedule, and you just shared so much valuable information. So we really appreciate you doing that. I hope this is also helpful for our listeners and any content creators that are listening to this. How can they contact you if they need services?
Yeah, so you can just find me at my website, LastineEntertainmentLaw.com. You can also find me on Instagram. I'm at Lastine Law, LASTINELAW. Pretty easy to find. Yeah.
Awesome. And
yeah, we definitely appreciate it for sure.
I think we're going to need your services too. So you've been doing this for a while. You're very knowledgeable and you're young, so you're staying on top of these developments. So we really appreciate that.
That's why I love my job. People go to a lawyer for a lot of different reasons, and most of the time it's because something bad has happened, divorce, death, bankruptcy, whatever have you. My clients come to me happy because their entertainment projects are becoming more and more successful, so they can buy my services and be even more successful. So I like to think that my area of the law is a little bit more fun than others.
Sure, absolutely.
So we should probably end now. If you got, we'll end it here, Joshua. If you want to just hang on for a minute after we're done, we'll talk about a couple other things.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hey, Hopheads, Frank here.
And Roman. Welcome to BrewsNBanter, the podcast where we sip and spill the funniest stories over a cold one.
We're not just brewing laughs and comedy. We also discuss life stories and current events in every episode.
Follow the frolic on our socials, where we brew up more than just banter. Check out linktree/BrewsNBanter for all the goods.
And guess what? We've got a VIP section. Join our Patreon for exclusive content, behind-the-scenes brew secrets, and maybe even a blooper reel or two.
Subscribe, laugh, and unlock the full BrewsNBanter experience. Because life is too short for bad beer and boring stories. Cheers.